Hi, welcome to Knit with Hannah. We are casting off today. I'm going to give you 3 methods on how to cast off your knitting. Hi, welcome to Knit with Hannah. I'm Hannah. I'm here with Knitting Natter to help you learn to knit the easy way. Yes, you heard me right. We're talking 3 methods of casting off today. That means once you've knitted your item, you can finish your knitting without the stitches unravelling all over the place. That's going to be nice and safe and secure. So I'm going to show you 3 methods. Let's get down to it. Here we are then, all ready to start knitting, and I have 3 projects that I'm going to cast off. So let's do the first one. This is the garter stitch knitting that I've been doing, and I have all of my needles ready for all of these projects. This is garter stitch, which means I've been knitting every single row, and that makes it quite simple. I don't have to even think about what I'm doing when I cast off. It is very simple beginner's cast off that you will learn for your first project very likely, and that involves knitting the first 2 stitches just as you've been knitting your stitches all the way through the rows, and then the first stitch that you've cast off is moved over the second stitch. We then knit another stitch and we repeat that process again. So the first stitch on the needle is moved over the second one. And there you go, that's it. That's all you have to think about. Knit every stitch, and when there are 2 stitches on the right hand needle, just take one over the next one. And I will do that all the way along the row. And for every garter stitch project, you will do this cast off. And for every other casting off, you will do a version of this. You're basically securing all of the stitches. It's very much like using crochet because the stitches are keeping each other in place. There you are. That's it. And when you get to this last stitch, you very simply cut the thread, or as I'm going to do here, I'm just going to move this ball of yarn through that loop, that last stitch, and there you go. That is it. That is your last stitch secured, and that is the knitting cast off. So that is the garter stitch cast off. That's the first, the most simple, the easiest cast off you will need to know in your knitting, and it's the one you will likely do most often. So then what happens? Let's have a look at this. This is knitting that is ribbed. We have 2 knit stitches alternating with 2 purl stitches all the way along the row. So we have to take that into account when we start casting off. Let me find the needle. I'm knitting with 6.5mm needles. This is chunky yarn. Now I'm going to cast off and look at the first 2 stitches on the row. These first 2 stitches tell me that I need to knit them. So I knit those first 2 stitches. You can tell they're knit stitches because it's smoother on this side. And just like I did with the garter stitch cast off, I move that first stitch over the second one. And now I'm at 2 purl stitches. So I need to move the yarn, purl the next stitch, and then crucially move the yarn to the back again before I cast off. Let me show you that again. I'm purling the next stitch, and then I'm moving the yarn to the back before I cast off. I'll show you what happens if I don't do that. If I keep the yarn at the front and then cast off that stitch, I mysteriously have 2 loops of yarn around the needle because this yarn is getting caught. So you have to move it to the back, or you'll wonder what on earth is going on. And then I'm going to move along the row, knit 1, knit 2, cast that one off, purl 1, cast off, purl 1, move yarn to the back and cast off, knit 1, cast off, knit 1, cast off, purl 1, move the yarn to the back, cast off, purl 1, move the yarn to the back, cast off, knit 1, cast off, knit 1, cast off, and I can continue that all the way along the row, and you can see that looks neat. It's not interfering with the pattern of the stitches at all, whereas it would do if you just do a simple garter stitch all the way along. You would notice it. I'm going to carry on doing that, and then we'll get ready for the third cast off method. There we are, that's that last stitch, and that's all finished. There you go. So we've now cast off garter stitch and we've cast off rib stitch. I'm now going to cast off this piece of knitting, which has knit stitches at the end. So it's garter stitches on the side, and it's stocking stitch, plain stocking stitch, knit 1 row, purl 1 row in the middle. So what I do want to point out is if you're knitting with stocking stitch, you need to have the smooth side facing you when you're casting off. You can use the same method as the garter stitch, but you have to make sure the smooth side is facing you, because you don't want the casting off to look odd when you're casting off. If I just show you more detailed, casting off here, when you're knitting every stitch, the stitch from the left hand needle moves onto the back of the knitting when you're knitting a stitch, and it moves to the front of the knitting when you're purling a stitch. So if you were to have this side facing when you cast off, you have to knit every stitch, so the discarded stitches would end up on the smooth side of the knitting, which wouldn't work at all. And to be perfectly honest, as nice as it would be to purl every stitch and cast off, just like in the very similar way as we've just done, I would say, why bother? We might as well utilise the fact that we can knit every stitch without having to move the yarn in between each stitch when we cast off. But what I want to show you here is if you've had experience casting off and you have realised that your casting off seems really tight, it scrunches the stitches together at the top, this certainly can happen, then what I suggest is using this method. You actually pick up a thicker needle for your cast off row. You're knitting all the way through this. In this case, it's 5.5mm needles. You've used 5.5mm needles for every single row. You get to the top, you know that your cast off is kind of tight and you don't want that to happen. Then pick up either 6mm or 6.5mm needles, and that's 1 or 2 sizes depending on which needle gauge you use. Then you will find it easier. You will find that you like the cast off much better. And this is quite useful actually, especially if you're making larger items and you have to join seams together. If you find that you have a tight edge when you're casting off, for example, around the top of a sleeve, and you need to join it to the main body of the sweater, then I would say most definitely use a thicker needle. That will really help with your cast off so that it fits smoothly and you can sew the seam together nice and neatly. So there you are. I am casting off with the same method that I used for the garter stitch. I'm knitting every stitch, and once there are 2 on the needle, I'm moving that first one over the second stitch. And it's a looser edge. It's a looser cast off. It's more comfortable, like I say, for certain projects. And if you have casting off experience and you've always had a cast off that seems just that little bit too tight, then this is an ideal option for you. Great, thank you for sticking around. You now know 3 methods of casting off. You can cast off your general knitting, you can cast off your ribbed knitting, and you can cast off if you're really having a problem with your tension. I hope that was helpful for you, and I hope you'll stick around, and I'll see you next week. Bye for now. Happy knitting.